We now have the pleasure of being joined by Patrick Stevens, a contributor to the Washington Post and Blue Ribbon Magazine. Patrick, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, fellas.
So, as you very well know, Syracuse and Georgetown coming up this weekend. Before we get into that matchup, though, the Hoyas last year won the Big East tournament, but the team is very different roster-wise than it was last year. Why was there so much turnover?
Well, there's a handful of things in there. You had some veteran guys that decided that it was time to go make some money somewhere doing something rather than use a fifth year. A guy like a Javon Blair falls into that category. You had a transfer in Kudus Wahab, who wound up going to Maryland, making the very short trip to College Park, where he has probably not been as effective for the Terps as he was for Georgetown last season. So there's a little bit of a mix in there of guys that fall into both of those categories. But you're right. The big picture is that when you kind of look at their roster and their significant contributors, they've still got Dante Harris, who played really well in the Big East tournament. They've still got Donald Carey, who's followed, I think, the unprecedented career arc of Mount St. Mary's, Siena, Georgetown. And then you got a couple big guys, Timothy Igohefe, who's out right now with a broken hand, and Malcolm Wilson, who played sparingly and has played a bit more of late. But for the most part, this is a team that's seen a lot of change, and there really isn't a whole lot of carryover from one year to the next.
Couple of tough losses so far for Georgetown early on in the season, a 4-4 overall record, but losses to Dartmouth to open the year, St. Joseph's. What's sort of gone wrong for the Hoyas in some of those losses that really stand out?
Well, I think the big thing that stands out is the defense as much as anything else, particularly on the perimeter. You go back and look at that Dartmouth game. Dartmouth was 16 of 38 from three. You look at the St. Joe's game, and St. Joe's was 11 of 32 for three. And I think Taylor Funk hit 8 3-pointers in that game for the Hawks. And frankly, I thought going into last night with the way UMBC had played, that was going to be a game that could follow that script. That, a team that had shot the lights out of the ball toward the end of last month. They dropped almost 100 on American, dropped almost 100 on Columbia. They beat Pitt, who's not good, but you still go on the road and beat a power conference school. You think that it's possible to go do the same at a Georgetown team that struggled. And for about, 20 minutes, maybe a little less, UMBC gave them a good run, but Georgetown ultimately pulled away. But even in that loss, UMBC went 11 of 31 from three. So to me, the big thing that stands out is the 3-point shooting. There's allowed 3-point defense. There's other issues that this team has, but that's the thing that stands out as much as anything else. I mean, they basically have to flirt with 75, 80 points to be able to win a game.
And so far, it's been a mixed bag for them. 4 wins, 4 losses. Really, for Patrick Ewing's entire tenure, they've just hung around 500. I mean, they have 2 500 seasons. In 18-19, they did go, 19 and 14, but the lone NCAA tournament berth was that, miracle run kind of in the Big East tournament to get there. I know he's Patrick Ewing, but is there, any warmth on his seat at this point? Did he quash that with the run last year? What's kind of his job security right now?
The one thing I would tell you about Georgetown is that it's a program that over the last 50 years, it's a place that has not really cared what other people thought and hasn't really tried to compare itself to any place else. So if you're trying to apply the way you might think about another school to them, it doesn't really hold. It's a little bit more of its own little world in a lot of ways. And it's been such a family thing from, John Thompson Jr. to his assistant, Craig Esherick, to his son, John Thompson III, and now to his best player, Patrick Ewing. It's been a very, very much a family thing at Georgetown. So it's hard to say how much pressure, if any, is really going to be applied. Even when you look out there and you see, 3,000 people announced for a game last night. There was a point in the first half where one of the guys missed the first of 2 free throws, and Ewing hollers out, make your free throws. And you could easily hear him on the other side of the floor, and the fans over there are all chuckling. It's like, yeah, you tell him, that's not supposed to happen, even in a home arena where people are trying to be quiet for your free throws. So I don't know if there is necessarily a whole lot of heat on him at this stage. It's interesting how things have kind of gone. The first year was a wash, basically. And then year 2, they bring in James Akinjo, who went to Arizona, is now at Baylor, Mac McClung, and Josh LeBlanc. And it looked like they had a good core. And then by the end of his third season, they were all gone. And then last year was a COVID year and kind of a wash, and they made something of it when nobody thought they would at the Big East tournament. So it's been a weird tenure so far. And obviously, this season hasn't been off to the most promising of starts either.
So a bit of a rocky start for the team overall, but someone who has impressed, Aminu Mohammed, the freshman, comes in, first 5-star recruit for the Hoyas in quite some time. So sort of a two-parter for you here, Patrick. What's enabled him to sort of step in and have this much success as a freshman? And as far as the recruiting standpoint is concerned, could this potentially be a sign of things to come for Georgetown recruiting, getting that first 5-star in quite a while?
It's certainly something that I think that they can build off of. It's something that they should hope that they can build off of. It's something that they should sell, that they have a guy that's been able to come in, play well instantaneously. Some of that's a matter of opportunity. I mean, there's minutes to be had, and you've got this really talented guy comes in. He's pretty good. But I've been impressed by just how hard he plays. I mean, he gets downhill really well on offense. I'm not sure that he's necessarily the best guy to go against Syracuse, but against a lot of teams, a team that typically plays man, I think he's probably as good a player as they have. I think the other thing that stood out about him is he's been a fantastic rebounder so far. He's averaging a little more than 8 rebounds a game. He's had at least 3 offensive rebounds in each of the last 7 games. So he's a guy that, he has his accolades. He's a guy that's played really hard for them so far. Not always perfectly, not always making the right decision, but he plays hard. And there's certainly a lot to be said about getting somebody in like that.
So you said he might not be the best guy to play against Syracuse. Who on the roster could, exploit that 2-3 zone?
Well, I think the answer to that, the number 1, number 2, and number 3 option for that is a kid named Caden Rice, who hit 10 3-pointers last night against UMBC. That's a school record. It had been originally set back in 1990 by Mark Tillman against Providence, and had been matched a bunch of times over the years. And then he went ahead and did it twice in their first 7 games, and then went 10 of 12 last night. So the thing is, he's been a little hot and cold. He went 0 for 8 against South Carolina on Sunday and was pretty fired up about that. So he's kind of evened it out a little bit. 10 of 20 is still pretty good overall. He's a grad transfer from the Citadel, 6'7", 215. And I described him last night as the stretchiest of stretch fours. You look at what he's been able to do so far this season. I think he's attempted 89 field goals, 75 of them are 3-pointers. There's no doubt what he's going to do. And so, I think he's a guy that could wind up not just making, but taking a lot of 3-pointers come Saturday against Syracuse.
Which department of this game do you expect to be the X factor that could determine who walks away victorious? Is it the shooting, the rebounding, the defense? What's something in particular that you're really going to be keyed in on?
Shooting on both ends, I think. Rice in particular, what sort of job does Syracuse do on him? I think everybody else is a little bit more questionable on the Georgetown side of things in terms of their shooting. I mean, I think Donald Carey is a guy that's capable of making shots and has at times in his career. I think the jury's still out as to how good a 3-point shooter Aminu Mohammed is. We're sitting here looking at 8 games worth of evidence at this point. And he's, I think, just looking at my notes here, 7 of 19. So pretty good. And then, Dante Harris is not necessarily the greatest of outside shooters. So I think how Syracuse does on Rice, and then at the other end, like we talked about a little earlier, Georgetown has really struggled. So which of those guys? Is it going to be one of the Boeheims? Is it going to be Joe Girard? Is it going to be even somebody else that's able to get the job done against a Georgetown team that does have some questions on the defensive end?
So this game, of course, in terms of each team's chance to make the tournament, not a huge matchup, but Syracuse and Georgetown. Does that rivalry still mean a lot to people in the Washington area?
Well, I think it would mean more if they knew that Georgetown was in for a good season. And it would probably, and I'm sure that from a Syracuse perspective, if you were sitting there thinking, gosh, these are two top 20 teams going at it, it would have a little bit more juice than what it has right now. I think that's probably fair. And I think that's the case with a lot of rivalries. So it's certainly, when you look at who Georgetown has had and will continue to have moving forward on its non-conference schedule, its home non-conference schedule this year, Dartmouth, American, Siena, Longwood, UMBC, Syracuse, Howard, and Texas Christian. So one of those stands out a little bit more than the rest. So I would expect it to be their biggest non-conference crowd of the season. It'll probably be one of their biggest crowds, period, of the season, when you think about, how much pull does Butler or Creighton or DePaul have coming into town either. But is it what it was in the 80s or the 90s or even, even in the tail end of the Big East years when Syracuse was there? Probably not. But it's still probably the most noteworthy non-conference game. It'll probably get the biggest fan turnout from Hoya's fans during non-conference play.
A whole lot of nostalgia surrounding the matchup for sure. Patrick, do you have a specific favorite Syracuse Georgetown memory that comes to mind over the years watching the two go at it?
Not really. And you got to understand, I was never somebody that was covering Georgetown day in and day out. I actually had spent much more time covering Maryland in the area. So I was sort of watching it from afar. But I obviously know all of the stories. You know the Manley Fieldhouse is closed story. You know the number of times that Big John and Jim Boeheim went at it. You know enough of those stories. You know about the last, the requiem for the Big East games, basically, from the 30 for 30 the last year in the Big East and all that. So there's obviously a ton of great memories, but I think other people probably have them a little more strongly forged than I do for both years.
I think mine has got to be the punch or the no punch, depending on what side you're on. Where
that's a fair choice.
Yeah, goes to the podium after and goes, Georgetown is a great team, but the better team didn't win tonight. And then he stands up and throws a chair at the wall, which is, he doesn't usually unleash his anger that, outwardly, at least not, in the last 15 years or so. So that one's pretty fun for me. I don't think we're going to see any chair tosses in this game, but I am wondering who, if you had to pick, do you think is going to win the game? And if you want to give a score, you can, but I won't hold you to it.
Yeah, I'm probably not going to throw a score out there because I haven't seen enough of Syracuse to realistically do that. But I do think Syracuse, with more shooting options and Georgetown's defensive issues, I think this Georgetown team or the Syracuse team is a little bit better and should be able to eke out a victory down in DC. The question with Georgetown, like I said earlier, can they score enough? And if they have a good shooting night, they're going to be in it. But if they're one of those teams that just happens to struggle with the zone, and there's enough of them over the years that have, enough Georgetown teams over the years have, then this could be a Syracuse victory and not just a small Syracuse victory. So I think so much of it comes down to, like we talked about earlier, the shooting on both ends of things. How does Georgetown deal with the zone, and can Syracuse exploit a defense that at times has left open just some absurdly open shots? I mean, there's been at least one in both of their last two home games where you were wondering if anybody was in the same area code as the guy shooting. So, Georgetown definitely with some defensive issues it needs to clean up and really should do it before Saturday.
Patrick, thanks so much for joining us today and giving us kind of the lowdown on the Hoyas.
Thanks so much for having me, Phil.